Hello and welcome to the National Gallery and this introduction to the Michelangelo and Sebastiano exhibition. My name is Matthias Wivel. I'm the curator of 16th century Italian paintings here at the gallery and the curator of this exhibition. Thank you for coming. It's great to see you. And it's great also to see our online viewers. This is our first live cast event. And welcome to all of you too. The exhibition concerns these two fellows. Michelangelo on the left in a portrait probably painted by Sebastiano, which is in the exhibition in the late teens when their friendship was at its height. And Sebastiano del Piombo in a woodcut engraving, the only portrait we have of him, from Vasari's Lives of the Artists from the 1550s. You see him here in his monk's outfit because he was made a Capuchin monk when he was given the Order of the Piombo by Clement VII in 1531. And that's really why he's called Sebastiano del Piombo. It's a nickname referring to this leaden seal with which he would stamp documents from the apostolic chamber. It was a sinecure given to him as a reward by the Pope, much later in life. Unfortunately, the only image we have of him. So it's not chronologically appropriate here. This is an exhibition not so much about comparing the geniuses of the two artists or setting up a competition with them, but more an exhibition that deals with the extraordinary relationship they had, creative relationship and friendship, and the works of art that came out of it. And also the meeting of the two traditions. Michelangelo was from Florence. He was schooled in the Florentine way of working and epitomized it in many ways. And Sebastiano, who came from Venice, a very different tradition, as one of the great painters of his generation, the same generation that begat Titian. So it's really about two traditions meeting two very different individuals with very different artistic sensibilities who create some incredible works on their own, and obviously in Michelangelo's case, there's a much bigger oeuvre around all of this. But Sebastiano too, who benefited a lot from this relationship, developed a very original approach to painting and to his subject matter. The first thing you see as you enter in the exhibition is this extraordinary relief carving by Michelangelo, which is usually at the Royal Academy, which has been lent extraordinarily to the exhibition, and which I would encourage all of you who visit the exhibition to go and look at it up close. It's really fantastic to see the subtlety of the carving, the changes of texturing that Michelangelo has left with it. And although it's unfinished, it's clearly part of his aesthetic of different levels of finish, and it's just marvelous. This relief also introduces us to the other important character of the exhibition, which is Christ. You see the Christ child here. You meet him as a child as you come into the exhibition, and here he's with his mother, and John the Baptist comes up. He's on the left. He's also a child. And he hands Christ a bird. It's probably a goldfinch, and the goldfinch is symbolic of Christ's passion and death. The child, Christ child, then squirms, startled at this fluttering bird, but then he turns his head and looks back. And this is the moment where he recognizes his fate. He's going to die on the cross for our sins. So it's a very poignant moment, and very typical of Michelangelo to include that. You see his face is not sort of psychologically individualized. It's very much in the classical tradition of Greek sculpture, not really with an expression. The expression is in the body, and that's really what Michelangelo does. He puts a lot of expression, emotion, spiritual engagement into his articulation of the human body, and that's his thing, and that's what he masters more than anybody. This picture then is juxtaposed in the exhibition with this painting, which comes from the National Gallery's own collection. It is a painting from the 15 teens. It's dated 1517, so never mind that date down there. It's wrong. And so this is after Sebastiano has met Michelangelo, and it shows, especially if you look at the Christ child in the two, but really the monumentality of form, also of the Virgin. You see how Sebastiano has assimilated Michelangelo's approach to form. Sebastiano probably didn't know the relief carving, but he knew Michelangelo's way of drawing the figure, and here he shows that he's understood it, and as well as anyone could. And he then, and this really sums up the narrative of the whole exhibition. We see Michelangelo's sculptural carving, his figures, and we see Sebastiano lending them deeply saturated, nuanced color in the Venetian manner, as you see here. Sebastiano came from Venice, as I said, and this is one of his great Venetian works, unfinished. It's in the exhibition, and you see it's kind of blurry because it's not finished. It's the Judgment of Solomon. So Solomon sits in judgment over the two women. Let's see if this works. Doesn't really seem to. Right and left, the two women, and it's a maternal dispute over the maternity to a child. You don't see the children here; they're not painted. But it is the episode where it's the moment where Solomon orders his executioner, the man on the right, who doesn't have a sword either because it's not finished, to cleave the living child in half. There's a dead child and a living child. And who is the mother of the living child? And so the mother, who's probably the woman on the right but might be the one on the left, offers to give the child to the other one to save it. And that's the moment you see here. What's really interesting in terms of understanding Sebastiano's technique and how it differs from Michelangelo's is that you can really see that in this painting. Is that there's something underneath. You see there's a face there in the shoulder of the executioner. That's the earlier iteration of the executioner, who's entirely different. You see him. It's that section over there on the right. So it's sort of the back and shoulder of the executioner as he is now, and you can see some lines behind the executioner too. And in the infrared, you can see that there's a lot of underdrawing here of an earlier composition, including a man on horseback. And then the executioner who faced front. I just wish this worked, but anyway. He's holding the child there and then facing front. He's under, I'll just show you. I mean, because it's quite difficult to look at infrared, but here you see this figure here. And his hand is coming down, the child would have been here. So Sebastiano is somebody who improvises, who works and changes as he's working, who alternates between drawing and painting when he's working. And this is just a detail of the dead child, which would have been the emotional crux of the painting, right in front, and it's centered just under Solomon. It's this amazingly foreshortened child here. We see the genitals here, and you see it's a real baby. It really shows the power of his draftsmanship. Michelangelo, on the other hand, and this is one of the also important juxtapositions early in the exhibition. This is a very early painting by Michelangelo, painted probably in Florence, sometimes said to be in Rome, but anyway, early. And it's in the National Gallery's collection. It's also unfinished. And you see this is very, very different. Everything here is planned. The lines on the left, which are, you see these lines here, they're sort of mechanical, they're stiff, and those lines are the result of a transfer. From a cartoon or another full-scale drawing transferred onto the panel before painting commenced. So everything's planned out in advance. And then, because everything is planned out in advance, he can paint each section as he wants to and finish sections entirely before starting on others. So it's a very different method. These two methods meet in their joint work, Sebastiano's and Michelangelo's joint work. Later, they would go on to be consolidated in the critical theory as disegno and colorito, design and coloring. And one was associated with Florence, the other one was associated with Venice. But it's a kind of a false dichotomy, and I hope the exhibition shows that it's more complicated than that. But there's something to it, obviously. So the two meet in Rome in 1511. Sebastiano comes there in August of 1511 in the train of a very wealthy banker, Agostino Chigi. And Michelangelo is already there. He's been there since 1505, working for Julius II, the Pope. And this is a very auspicious moment. It's a moment of the greatest opening, probably in the history of art, the greatest art opening. It's the opening of this, the Sistine Chapel ceiling. It's not finished yet. It's 2/3 finished. And there's been a lull in activity on it because the Pope has been away. But it's finally unveiled the 2/3, and it, of course, causes a sensation. It's so full of invention, of figures that people have never seen before. It becomes a repository for artists for centuries after that, for ideas. So a great sensation. The other thing that's exhibited is this, or opened is this, the Stanza della Segnatura in the Papal Apartments just upstairs, by Raphael. Slightly younger, about contemporary of Sebastiano, 10 years younger than Michelangelo. Has been in Rome since 1508 and has quickly muscled in on this commission, the Papal Apartments. And they've been painting them in conjunction with each other, in competition with each other, and they're unveiled at the same time. Of course, it's the decoration that has the famous School of Athens, as you see there on the right. And this inevitably they're compared. It's a competition. It's a competition for mastery of art. And while people are incredibly impressed with Michelangelo's command of the figure and the three-dimensionality of his figures, they think his coloring, as you see on the left, is very harsh, very old-fashioned. It's not naturalistic. It doesn't look like color as you see it in real life. Whereas Raphael, and this is not a fantastic slide, but Raphael has a much greater nuance in his coloring. It's much closer to life. So the reaction is a little bit that Raphael can do anything Michelangelo can do, but he colors better. And this really bothers the paranoid Michelangelo, who feels that Raphael is muscling in on his territory and getting the great commissions. And also, he happens to be younger, more handsome, more charming, just like really annoying. So Michelangelo feels bothered by this. And that is what leads him to his alliance with Sebastiano. And this is their first work, produced between 1512 and 1516. We don't know exactly when. And it's an exhibition. It's one of the centerpieces of the exhibition, and arguably their great masterwork. The Pietà. It's a virgin mourning the dead Christ. He's lying in front of her, isolated from her, as you see, and she sits there in the night. The idea is that of this alliance between Michelangelo and Sebastiano, which starts with this painting, is that Michelangelo provides Sebastiano with drawings that he then paints. So Michelangelo has designed the two figures. Sebastiano has transferred them onto the panel and painted them, and then painted the landscape around them. Landscape is not something Michelangelo was at all interested in. So it's one thing that Sebastiano really added to the mix. But you also see that the sensuality of the body of Christ here, who's placed in front of us as if on the altar, when taking Eucharist, when symbolically eating the body of Christ, the worshippers would look right at this incredibly sensual body of Christ that you want to touch it. It's like so like the tactility and the beauty of it is really striking, and it's the testament to Sebastiano's skill at modeling and bringing out the qualities of this palette, dead flesh, and still making it attractive. The modeling, of course, comes from Michelangelo, the actual modeling of the figure. And then there's, of course, this very muscular Virgin. Obviously, it's based on Michelangelo's breakthrough sculpture, which was in the Basilica of St. Peter's, which is included in the exhibition in a plaster cast. Obviously, the original would never leave St. Peter's. And it's based on that, but where in the first Pietà, the sculptural Pietà, Christ is cradled by Mary in this very tender moment. In this, they're isolated, and it accentuates her grief, I think, and the fact that she's alone. And this, I think, more than anything, there's lots of theological subtext to this, but what's really important is that this is a mother with her dead son, and she's alone and has to forge on. And this, I think, is what makes it so incredibly moving. What people were really amazed by when they saw this painting was not so much Michelangelo's figures, because after all, they had. I'll just show you. We also have the wonderful drawing here just to show you how he worked up part of an idea of the figure, the hands and the torso of the figure. And on the other side of that drawing is a study for one of the nude figures in the Sistine Chapel ceiling. So it's very closely connected to the Sistine Chapel ceiling, all of this. No, but what people really, really amazed by was this landscape. It's not so much on Michelangelo's figures, but this landscape, because nobody had seen anything like it. And this is the reason for their alliance. It's that we have an artist who comes in from Venice with the most sophisticated cutting-edge oil technique that nobody's seen in Rome before, and really amazes people with what he can do. And this is an oil technique developed in the circle of Giorgione, who was Sebastiano's mentor, and which Titian would, of course, make his own in the following decades in Venice. And this was where Sebastiano was a threat to Raphael, because Raphael is a great colorist, great technical ability, but there were things Sebastiano could do that he hadn't yet learned. And that was the reason why Michelangelo thought, okay, we can marginalize Raphael by working together. My drawings, your painting, will take out Raphael. And just look at these. I mean, they're just astonishing. It's almost like an impressionist painting. The brushwork is so fluid, it's so atmospheric. It's just, I mean, you get a sense of why people marveled at this. It's the freest and most virtuosic of Sebastiano's passages in Sebastiano's art. I think it's just fantastic. Raphael responded very quickly to this, and there has always been this question about why did Raphael change, his style change so much? Why did he go much more for stronger contrast and greater atmospheric qualities in the Stanza degli Adoro next to the Stanza del Segnatura, the one he did afterwards? And I think it's very largely a response to Sebastiano that it prompts this change in Raphael's art. And this is his spectacular nocturnal image of the liberation of St. Peter in that room. So, Julius died in 1513, Julius II, and his successor was Leo X, who was a Medici pope. He was son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, the former de facto ruler of Florence, and had, in his youth, had known Michelangelo, because Michelangelo was in the house of Lorenzo when he was young, learning sculpture. So Leo becomes pope, and he is very taken with Raphael and really gives all the jobs to Raphael. But the chap next to him, to his left, or to the left of him, to his right, is Giulio de' Medici, his cousin, and his closest advisor, the cardinal. And he commissioned the next great work from Sebastiano, the National Gallery's Raising of Lazarus. And that picture was commissioned alongside an equally large altarpiece by Raphael. So it put them in direct competition, and clearly intentionally. So he wanted to get the most out of these two artists. It was for the Cathedral of Narbonne in southern France, where Giulio had been awarded a very important bishopric, which was part of the peace dealings that Leo had with France. So it's a very important commission. So he commissioned the two greatest painters in Rome to work on it. And Sebastiano did this, and it's the raising of Lazarus from the Gospel of John. You see the moment where Christ speaks the words, "Lazarus, come forth," and his friend, who's been laying in his tomb for 4 days, walks out of the tomb, and he comes back to life. His two sisters, Lazarus' two sisters, Mary and Martha, Mary, are both there too, as described in this gospel. Mary falls to her knees, and Martha recoils in awe at what has happened. And this is really key to understanding this image, the different psychology of the various characters. And this is something Sebastiano does, even more than Raphael. He psychologizes the individual figures. And you see here, it's like this teeming mass of figures. And everybody has a different reaction. We have the people who immediately recognize the miracle, St. Peter and Mary. We have the disciples here discussing it, debating it intellectually or otherwise. We have people being shocked. We have people holding their noses at the smell coming from the tomb. We have Martha's reaction of awe. We have the attendants who act like contractors. They're solving a practical problem here of unwrapping Lazarus. And Lazarus himself has just drawn his first breath. Life has returned to his body, and he's physically in shock. And he looks wide-eyed at Christ, and his body is still stiff. You see, there's a stiffness to it, which is sort of lingering rigor mortis. And he's being you see the color also of his skin is very similar to Christ in the Pietà. He's been dead. He's very athletic for somebody who's been in the tomb for 4 days. But this is then the way of painting. You idealize your figures at this point, and not least Michelangelo, who did this figure. I'll just return to that in a minute, but just to go back to this idea of interaction, that comes from Raphael. This is Sebastiano emulating Raphael. This is the great Disputa in the Stanza delle Signature, and there's this rhythmic interaction between the figures down here. Nobody can do this like Raphael. He's so eloquent at placing figures next to each other and having them interact. And Sebastiano's trying to do that. He's trying to have this interaction around a central event. Not as successfully as Raphael would do it, but still, and he gets something really interesting out of it. And I think something very generous, because we, as the viewer and the worshippers at the time, are encouraged to think about this miracle, just like the characters in the actual painting. So we're encouraged to debate and discuss it, and I think that's a really generous gesture and quite distinct to the way Sebastiano works. Some discoveries we've made in connection with this. So as I said, Michelangelo designed this figure and the figures around him, and that's always been recognized. People knew it at the time. It's the most memorable figure by far in the painting. I think that's inarguable. And this is really what Michelangelo gives to Sebastiano. He gives him memorable, dynamic figural inventions that he can use. And Sebastiano is not able to do this, to articulate a figure that you just remember immediately, whereas Michelangelo he's incapable of drawing a boring figure. It's like he poses a figure and it's etched into your mind as soon as you see it, and that's what he's doing here for Sebastiano. And people would know that this was Michelangelo's contribution. That was quite clear. It's like a cameo inserted into his painting. But that figure was then recognized. I mean, it's always been recognized as Michelangelo, as I said, since the 16th century. And it's always been thought that Michelangelo was part of the commission, and he actually contributed it from the start. But that appears not to be the case. With new infrared recordings of the painting, we've managed to discern a figure underneath, which corresponds to this outline sketch in a drawing in the exhibition by Sebastiano, which is a sketch for Lazarus, I think, quite clearly. This is a very little seen drawing, which is exhibited for the first time here. And you see here it is in pink, that figure. And it's fully painted. You can see everything in the facial features, everything's there. That figure is most likely Sebastiano's own first version of Lazarus. So it was a commission that he was dealing with. As I will explain in a minute, Michelangelo was not there. He'd gone to Florence to work on Leo X's orders, so he was actually not there. So Sebastiano was painting this in 1517, and he painted that figure. Then Michelangelo comes back from Florence in January of 1518 to ratify a contract for one of the Medici projects that he's doing in Florence, and he comes into Sebastiano's studio, and what we imagine happened is that he looks at it and immediately zooms in, sort of zeroes in on the Lazarus figure and says, "This is not good enough, is it?" I mean, he just gets lost in the crowd. How about we do this? And then he does this drawing, which is an inversion of the great creation of man from the Sistine ceiling. You see, it's just a vertical, so animated by touch. And Sebastiano paints that with the arm out. So he paints that. Then they realize, while Michelangelo is still in town, probably, he's there for a few weeks, they realize that's wrong, that doesn't really work, because it doesn't really meet the hand, and it's kind of awkward. There's an awkward fit. So he does this drawing. And then that drawing is what ends up on the surface. So this is a new discovery which lends to Sebastiano much greater initiative in terms of this composition, and it is really a commission for him, and it's done in the Venetian manner. Whereas the Viterbo Pietà was done using a cartoon, using Michelangelo's drawings and the cartoon transferred to the panel. This is done in the improvised manner you saw with the Judgment of Solomon, where Sebastiano's changing his mind a lot. There's a lot of changes across the surface of the painting, and where Michelangelo enters onto those premises, working with Sebastiano in a Venetian way. This is Raphael's response. It's of course hugely famous and amazing, and it's in the Vatican and can't be lent, so it's not in the exhibition. I wish. It's a very much Raphael showing Sebastiano, I can do this better. You know, he takes the figures, the apostles reacting to the miracle much more harmoniously. He has a kneeling woman much more three-dimensional, and then he has this floating Christ. It's the transfigured Christ on Mount Tabor, where his divinity is confirmed by this vision with Moses and Elijah here, and the apostles see it on the. And it's just an astonishingly memorable painting. It's what Raphael does best. It's his last painting, and he died just before it was finished. And it was actually the first exhibited next to his bier in the studio where he lay after he died. So the competition, in a sense, ended at that point. And it was sort of tragic. He was only 37, which for that time wasn't so old, or so young, but still, he was such a powerhouse, creative powerhouse, that it was a big shock to everybody that he would suddenly pass away. Anyway, that picture takes off also from another composition by Sebastiano, which is the third great collaboration between Michelangelo and Sebastiano, which is a chapel. It's the mural decorations of a chapel in San Pietro in Montorio in Rome. And the commission came to them in 1516 from a banker, Pier Francesco Bolgarini, a friend of both artists, and with whom Michelangelo was infatuated. And so he went out of his way to help him. And this commission was a joint commission. Michelangelo was to design it, do the drawings, and Sebastiano was to paint it. In the event, he only actually managed to do this. I'll return to that in a minute. But this is Sebastiano using Michelangelo-esque ideas and painting by himself. And here you see, this is what Raphael, okay, so you have a very heavy, muscular Christ standing, very impressive, but I can make him fly. I can make him float, levitate. So it's the last gesture of Raphael's superiority, maybe, I guess, before he died. And actually, Sebastiano kept working through Raphael after his death, and sort of competing with him even after he was dead. But this is remarkable, and especially for this flagellation of Christ. I don't want to get into the iconography. It's so complicated, very, very interesting, but it would take the rest of the afternoon to talk about. It's very tied into religious reform movement of the time, and this church was the center of a congregation of Franciscan monks who were especially reform-oriented. Everybody wanted to reform the church. And what is happening at this time is the run-up to the Reformation, to Luther's thesis in Wittenberg. And everybody, including the Pope, realizes something is wrong with the church, something has to happen. And this iconography, which is very dense and complex, is a way of addressing that. But I will encourage you to look at the catalog for further elucidation of that, because it's so complicated. But this was really their, but very interesting, so please do, if you can. This is their most famous collaboration. This is the one that had the greatest reverberations. It's just, again, it's Michelangelo doing something really memorable. And in the exhibition, we are exhibiting it with the drawings, the Michelangelo's drawings and Sebastiano's drawings for this chapel. So you can take a closer look there. It's almost any and every depiction of the flagellation of Christ after this uses this as the model, including Caravaggio's famous one in Naples. Caravaggio was very indebted to Sebastiano in many ways, although he was a completely different artist and very much his own. He looked at Sebastiano, and really many artists did, and I think this is something that has been overlooked a bit, because Sebastiano has been overlooked, but his importance is seen in Poussin, it's seen in Spanish painting of the 17th century, it's seen in Zurbarán. It's really in a lot of places. But artists that are so great that they also, of course, are their own. So the more Slavish Sebastiano imitators die out in the latter 16th century. Anyway, this chapel in the exhibition is exhibited in an almost full-scale replica made by a group called Factum Arte, based in Madrid, who specialize in rematerializing works of art, as they call it. And they record archaeological sites for preservation. So endangered archaeological sites, they go out and record the objects there to have 3D digital models of them. And they can really reproduce works of art to an astonishing level of fidelity, which they've done for the exhibition in this chapel that is almost there at full size. And here you see them recording. They just take photographs, and that's how they do it. And then they make a digital model based on the hundreds and hundreds of photographs they've taken. They stitch it together into this three-dimensional model, and then they can print it. Here you see the half dome being constructed with the printouts being adhered to this sort of stage set model. Here they're printing the flagellation. And here they're fashioning the skirting at the bottom out of plaster, copying the original skirting using traditional methods. So that's really amazing. Another thing in the exhibition that is spectacular and a real privilege to be able to do is the juxtaposition of the near juxtaposition of these two statues. These are two statues by Michelangelo. The one on the left is in the exhibition in the original. It's a marble, over life-size marble sculpture of the nude Christ. It comes from a church in a monastery north of Rome in Bassano Romano, and it was only rediscovered 20 years ago. It had sunken into obscurity. It's documented in the sources, but nobody knew what had happened to it. And this is it. This is the Michelangelo. The other one is much more famous. It's in the Santa Maria sopra Minerva in Rome. And what is interesting about this, in part, is that they're made for the same commission. So they were made for Santa Maria sopra Minerva, for a family chapel there. And Michelangelo started carving the first one in around 1514, 1515, something like that, for this family. And the manager of the project was a friend of his, a humanist who was very well versed in humanist thinking and theological reform thinking and so on. And the idea here is to update the classical tradition into a Christian context, which is really what the Renaissance very much is about. So to draw upon the classical tradition, to have this Greek god, it's like an Apollo, but rendered as in the form of Christ, basically. And then nude to show his humanity, full humanity, his unblemished humanity. And he's idealized as a heroic, triumphant Christ after his resurrection. And as I told you, we started with Christ in the Christ child realizing that he was going to die. Then we have the dead Christ in the Viterbo Pietà. Then we have the Lazarus, which is the raising of Lazarus was a resurrection that prefigures Christ's own resurrection, which we then have here. And Christ's resurrection is something that obsessed Michelangelo. He was the redemption promised by Christ on the last day. The redemption for our sins was something that really obsessed him, and it was a very personally resonant subject matter for him, as indeed for any Christian. But really, it's something that he works on again and again and again, and here in sculptural form. So it's fantastic to be able to do this. What happened to this statue was that he was carving it, and he was very busy. He had other much more pressing and prestigious commissions going at the same time from the Pope and so on, but he wanted to do this because it was for a friend of his. And then he discovered that in this wonderful piece of shining white marble, you'll see how it's almost translucent, this wonderful marble. There was a flaw. There was a flaw running through, a fault line. And not just anywhere, but what would be Christ's face. So, I mean, just horrible. I mean, all the work was wasted. He abandoned it in frustration, left it unfinished, eventually gave it as a gift to the patron, and sat in his garden and then sunk into obscurity, as I said. It was acquired for the Giustiniani family in the early 17th century, and then it was finished by an unknown sculptor at that time. That's why it looks so finished. So the back is by this other artist. The face is finished by this other artist. If you go to the exhibition, something that's very instructive is to look at the left and the right hand. The left hand down there, holding the shroud, is very fully articulated. It's real Michelangelo. The right hand is sort of pasty and flat, and that's probably because it's finished by this other artist. The cross, of course, also added. So that was an unfinished sculpture. But then, even though he didn't have time, he eventually fulfilled the commission with the second statue, which then went into the church. It was delivered in 1521, and Sebastiano was involved in installing it. And you see the difference between the two. The first one is at rest in classical contrapposto, like a Greek sculpture, self-contained. The second one is dynamic, moving, turning, looking out. And it's engaging with its surroundings as if something is going on around it. We become part of the story when we look at the statue. And this is the beginning of Baroque sculpture, I think. This is the beginning of Michelangelo thinking of sculpture in the round. Most of his sculptures are really meant to be seen from one angle, or at least from a very few angles from the front. They're not meant to be walked around. And this is not fully three-dimensional, it's not fully meant to be seen from every angle, but it's the beginnings of it. If you walk around the statue, which in the show is represented by a plaster cast, we could never borrow the original. So we have a plaster cast, a very high-quality plaster cast from the 19th century. And if you walk around that, you'll see how it moves with you. It looks very different from different angles, and that's the point. It's Michelangelo developing towards a much greater dynamism in his art. He's internalized the academic lessons from classical antiquity, and now he's doing incredible things with them, infusing them with emotion and spiritual energy. So, as I said, Michelangelo, by the time he did the second one, he was in Florence, where he stayed until 1534. So, most of the relationship between Sebastiano and Michelangelo is a long-distance one. From 1516 to 1534, they only see each other a couple of times when Michelangelo visits Rome on business. And this has yielded a fascinating correspondence between them. And we have examples of that in the exhibition, which it's just so lively. It really gives you an insight into their daily lives, the daily problems they were encountering, their ideas. The rivalry with Raphael is very pointed in the early letters, how much Sebastiano hates him, and by proxy how much Michelangelo hates Raphael, and so on. It's really this letter from it's just an example. This letter from the British Library starts with Sebastiano thanking Michelangelo for becoming godfather to his first son, who was born the same year as he finished the Lazarus, 1519, and it's a very, very touching letter. So he addresses, from this point on, he addresses Michelangelo as compare, which means godfather, and which really connotes kinship. So they're very close, but and probably because it's a long distance relationship, they remain close for a long time, paradoxically. Here, this is Clement VII. This is Giulio de' Medici, the patron of the Transfiguration and the raising of Lazarus. He becomes Pope in 1523, and he's the greatest patron that Sebastiano had, and one of the greatest and most understanding patrons that Michelangelo had. Extremely important to both artists. And whereas his cousin preferred Raphael, he clearly loved Michelangelo and also knew him from his youth. Here you see Sebastiano's two portraits of him from the exhibition. One is painted in 1525 to 6, and it's really very Michelangelo-esque. It looks like the prophets of the Sistine ceiling, but it's based on Raphael's portrait of Julius II, which had become the paradigm for papal portraiture. It's in our collection in Gallery 8. We haven't put it into the exhibition. And just he was famously handsome, and there's an arrogance. It's a real portrait of power. This portrait. Then you have the second one, which is some years later, and you see it's a very intimate, almost unfiltered likeness. It's not a finished portrait. It's probably a sketch, and he's looking inward. He's a broken man. He's also sick at this time, and he's affected by what has happened in the meantime. I'm certain that this is partly what's happening, because in the meantime, this happened. Clement's time as Pope was really fraught. He was dealing with the Reformation, which was in full gear, and then he was dealing with the constant proxy wars being fought in Italy by the great powers of Europe. And through an unfortunate alliance with France, he antagonized the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, whose troops eventually marched to Rome and sacked it. And thousands of people were killed, people were raped, buildings were burned, they took people ransom. It's horrible, horrible. Disaster for the papacy and for European civilization. I mean, that was really how it was cast at the time. This is one of these events that makes everything change in history. And after this, there's a darkness and you see it in art and so on. And this engraving shows the Pope, who was under siege in the Castel San Angelo in Rome by the imperial forces for 7 months, watching his city being initially pillaged and burned, and then later just under the domination of these troops. And Sebastiano was probably there with him. He was probably there with him at that time during the siege. So it's a really traumatic experience. And finally, the Pope managed to escape to Orvieto, where he set up a makeshift court. Sebastiano escaped to his native Venice, and some years went by before they both returned. When they returned, and this is the late phase of Sebastiano's career, and there's a very touching letter to Michelangelo in the exhibition where he describes how he's never going to feel the same. He's never going to be the same Bastiano that Michelangelo knew from before. He's sort of a shattered, traumatized man, and he can't really work so much anymore, but he still does. And this is one of the few major works that he almost finished in his later career, in the 1530s. It is one of 2 large commissions taken over from Raphael. This is Credit Chapel in Santa Maria del Popolo, which is a church very important to Julius II. And you see, this is Raphael's mosaic ceiling, and the architecture is all Raphael, and the sculpture and so on. But this altarpiece of the Nativity of the Virgin is Sebastiano's last great work. Not in the exhibition, can't travel, painted on stone, which is something that's very important to Sebastiano at this time. He's developing oil techniques for applying to stone, and that's something that was not very well known in Italy and Rome. And it allows him to create, it's a terrible image, I'm sorry, but it allows Sebastiano to create greater nuance and atmosphere and contrast in his mural paintings, which is something he really wanted to do. He was an oil painter through and through, and did not really like fresco much. He did paint fresco, he was trained in it, but he really preferred this. And this is a great example of it. You see, it's the Virgin here with her midwives. Here's Elizabeth. Here's Joachim and Joseph meeting each other, and behind that there's the vanishing point. There's a classical sculpture. So that's the Old Order. That's the Old Testament, the New Testament, and here is God presiding over it, turning to the side that has the mother and the child here. This was something for which Sebastiano solicited drawings from Michelangelo. Michelangelo apparently did not send any, but Michelangelo would help Sebastiano with drawings occasionally. He would send him drawings from Florence to use in his paintings. And Sebastiano would help Michelangelo with his business in Rome. He became a middleman for him and help him negotiate contracts and so on. So they had a sort of a mutually dependent relationship during these years. This is a drawing where Sebastiano gets closer to Michelangelo than almost anywhere. You see, this is God the Father, probably meant for that figure up there, floating in the air. And this is, of course, its source of inspiration, the Sistine Chapel. And you can see there's a great energy here, but there's not the three-dimensionality and the muscularity and the clear definition of the body that you see in Michelangelo. but it's very much it's his painterly assimilation of Michelangelo's very sculptural way of drawing. It's in the exhibition. The other commission taken over from Raphael is at Santa Maria della Pace. They're both Chigi commissions, and Chigi was as I said, the man I introduced at the beginning who brought Sebastiano to Rome. And these two family chapels were first given to Raphael, then Raphael died, then Chigi died, and then Sebastiano took them over. And he was meant to paint a risen Christ here. You see, these are Raphael's beautiful frescoes, very inspired by the Sistine Chapel, to Michelangelo's great irritation. He's taking the Sistine Chapel Sibyls and turning them into this elegant, melodious composition up here. Very irritating to Michelangelo. And probably because Michelangelo was irritated with this, he actually helped Sebastiano with a drawing for this, or several drawings for this risen Christ. And we believe this might be the one. We don't know for sure. This is in the exhibition, an extraordinary drawing of the risen Christ, the heroically risen, nude Christ. Sebastiano never painted it. And really in the later 30s, he probably painted very, very little, if anything at all. And this is something Michelangelo disapproved of. And indeed, this is great. This is a great juxtaposition. I'll just show something about Michelangelo, and I've been talking a lot about Sebastiano here. This is a sketch for that drawing. And look at the energy, the vigor of that, the black chalk that he's using here. He's trying to position the legs, and it becomes this incredibly dynamic figure that almost attains a spiritual energy to it, because it has this vigor. And all of that energy and vigor is corked up and sort of and contained in the very, very finished, highly modeled drawing over there. It has all that energy inside it. And this is, I think, Michelangelo's secret. He imbues his figures with such energy. And indeed, it's what he does here, the Last Judgment. Michelangelo was called back by Clement in 1534 to paint this in the Sistine Chapel. It's a reflection of the dark moments the church had come through. He was going to paint this and the Fall of the Rebel Angels, which he never finished, or never even started, on the other side of the Sistine Chapel. Two very dark, apocalyptic scenes. And this one, of course, he did finish, and he finished it in fresco, but initially something else happened. And this is the direct cause of their falling out. They've been friends for so long. Michelangelo comes back, Sebastiano is ecstatic, they're going to be together again, they're going to help each other, and there are accounts of people seeing them together in the first year or so that Michelangelo was back in Rome. But then he started painting this, and as Michelangelo tells it, Sebastiano went behind his back to the Pope and convinced him that Michelangelo was going to paint it in oil, in this new technique that he developed. And obviously, Michelangelo would never paint in oil. The idea is absurd. He's a fresco. If he's a painter at all, he's a fresco painter. And oil is a medium for women and lazy artists, like Sebastiano. So he dismissed them, and they never spoke again. This is the story we hear from Vasari. And there's some truth to it, surely. They must have fallen out, and probably over this. However, it seems very unlikely that Sebastiano would be able to convince the Pope to do something against Michelangelo's will. That just seems very unrealistic. And a follower of Michelangelo describes in the 1580s, he's writing about something else. Pellegrino Tebaldi is his name. He's writing about something else, and he writes that Michelangelo had initially intended to paint this wall in oil. We don't know for sure, but we know that the plaster preparation that was initially put up, which was for oil, probably for oil, was taken down by Michelangelo. It was demolished by him, and then new preparation was put up, and he finished it in fresco, as he really always had wanted, according to himself. But the fact that there was a first preparation and about 9 months went by indicates that Michelangelo was entertaining the idea of painting it in oil. He may even have tried painting it in oil and then realized, I can't do this. I hate it. This is not working. I'm going to do this in fresco. And it would make sense, because Michelangelo hadn't painted anything monumental for 20 years, since the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And back then, he surely still remembered the sting when people preferred Raphael's coloring to his. So he's probably listening to his friend here, who's developed this spectacular new technique, which he's applying with great success at various places around Rome, including the Nativity of the Virgin. And just decides, let me try it. I can do anything. And then he realizes he can't, or doesn't want to, or hates it, or whatever. And indeed, it would have been impractical to paint this very large painting in oil. What happens in this painting is that actually there are moments of revision of the kind. You don't see it in the ceiling. You don't see those kinds of revisions. Revisions on top of the paint layer in dry medium, al secco. So fresco is painted in the wet plaster, and it fuses, the paint fuses with the wall and becomes very stable. But then sometimes you retouch on top of that just with the paint on the dry plaster. That's called al secco, and there are many revisions here of that kind. Some of them are of practical nature because you have to have a continuous blue across the surface, and for that you have to have secco. But others are to the figures, and that's very how Sebastiano worked. Also, down here, it's been determined that some of this is oil paint. There are some hues and colors that were not achievable in fresco. So he's used oil. So this is really maybe the moment where Sebastiano actually has an influence on Michelangelo. Not an influence in terms of ideas, not an influence in terms of, direct creativity or anything like that, but technical. Or at least initially. And then, so it's not as pure and as cut and dry as Michelangelo makes it out to be when he tells the story to his biographers, Vasari and others. And really what happens when he does that is that he disparages Sebastiano to an extent that helped destroy his reputation, or at least diminish it. It was also, of course, Sebastiano's reputation was damaged by the fact that he was working alongside Michelangelo and Raphael, these two great geniuses, of course. It's very difficult to be next to those two. And in Venice, where he came from, there was Titian, who became one of the greatest artists of the time. So he sort of recedes into the background because of those. But I think Michelangelo contributed to our slightly negative take on Sebastiano, it goes back to the 16th century, and it comes directly to Michelangelo. So it's a really kind of a sad ending. In the exhibition, we don't really talk so much about that. We talk more about continuities in their life to have an upbeat ending. And as we had the child Christ at the beginning, we have the dead Christ, we have the risen Christ, and at the end we have the promise of the unborn Christ in the form of the Visitation from the Louvre, fantastic painting, finished at the same time as the Lazarus, and probably the most emotionally resonant and powerful of Sebastiano's paintings. It's the Virgin and Elizabeth meeting while they're pregnant. One, of course, with Jesus, the other with John the Baptist. And John the Baptist leaps in the womb when Elizabeth approaches Mary because he's close to Christ. So this is this beautiful Venetian landscape, very Michelangelesque, like strong figures with these foreshortenings, and just astonishing light. And then you see these forms, these blocky forms of the figures. That is really where Sebastiano is going. He's somebody who tries to pare down forms. He eschews sentimentality, and he wants to simplify, so we can just contemplate the essential spiritual message of his paintings. And that's what he does in the second version, which is also in the exhibition. The second version he did, which is in the 1530s, in Santa Maria della Pace. I'm sorry, I only have black and white images of it, but you can see it up there, and it's extraordinary. This is a mural painting in oil on plaster, oil on the wall, his new technique. And it's quite damaged. It was never finished. Like most of Sebastiano's projects in the 30s, it was never finished. And it was taken down in the early 17th centuries, and 3 fragments survive. These are the other 2. And they're at Alnwick Castle in the Northumberland collection. Here, exhibited here for the first time outside of Alnwick. And you see these pictures, and they're a little bit sort of rebarbative. They're bits. They might sort of put you off a little bit initially. There are 2 things you have to remember about these. One is that they're meant to be seen at a distance of 8 to 9 meters. The other is the extraordinary development that they evince from this atmospheric, deeply saturated coloring of the late teens to this austere, monumental, still very sharply colored, but this monumental, like pared down, blocky, proto-cubist, as the great Sebastiano Michelangelo scholar Michael Hirst called it. It's almost as if Picasso could have painted something like this in the 20s. It looks like it's that modernist in a way before the fact. So really a fascinating development, and one that has very little to do with Michelangelo. I mean, Michelangelo is always there. He's there in the great forms. He's there in the idea of condensing a spiritual message. But these are frozen in time, sort of still images where Michelangelo is extremely emotional and dynamic in his late years. And this is a painting that could not come to the show. It would be wonderful to have had it. It's in Budapest. It can't travel. It's painted on slate, which is his preferred medium in these years. And you just see, I mean, this could have been painted in the 20th century. Not that makes anything better, but it's really just an extraordinarily powerful image that shows you where Sebastiano evolved, where he evolved. Something very different from Michelangelo. He was always, I think, the point of this is that he was always a very original artist. He was very beholden to Michelangelo. He hero worshipped him clearly, and he was dependent on him for a lot of things. But he was a different artist and had a different sensibility, and I think it really comes out in these late images that are less directly beholden to Michelangelo's example. So I will end on that note and say thank you for listening, both here and online. And then I just want to advertise that we have a conference which will be in our program, but be announced soon. We have an international conference open to the public the 23rd and 24th of June at the end of the exhibition's run. Thank you.